We're here. It's the final round of the 2024 season, and we're here to make our predictions, our final predictions for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix to wrap up a very exciting 2024 campaign in Formula One. What's going on, guys? Welcome back. We're here to talk about the final round of the 2024 season. Can you believe it's here already? I know it feels like just yesterday, but also 1,000 years ago that the 2024 campaign kicked off with a dominant Red Bull performance in Bahrain. But here we are, a very, very fun and exciting season under our belts once again. The constructors still up for grabs. The drivers already decided, been pretty much decided since the beginning of the season. But that's not going to stop us from talking about all of the exciting things that are left to happen, as well as making our predictions for what we think is going to befall upon us in this final round of the season. We're going to make predictions for our biggest positive surprise, our biggest disappointments, our qualifying top three, our race podium, and for the final time, our one crazy prediction. Let's jump on into it. Before we jump into our biggest positive surprise, if you haven't already and you have enjoyed the 2024 season, please go ahead, hit the subscribe button down below. We have some fun plans going into next year for F1, as well as doing a lot of sim racing content on this channel as well. We'd love to have you join our little community, as well as leave a comment down below after we do our predictions what you think is going to happen this weekend in Abu Dhabi. I'd love to hear what you guys have in store for us. And as always, if you enjoy the video at any point, leave a like rating. It really helps me out. Let's go ahead. Let's jump on into our biggest positive surprise. And we're going with the Silver Arrows. Lewis Hamilton is my pick for biggest positive surprise, for the simple fact and simple facts only that I refuse to believe that Lewis isn't going to come out and finish his stint with Mercedes, a dominant stint, an unforgettable stint in Formula One with Mercedes on a high note. I refuse to believe that anything else besides a Lewis performing very, very well is going to happen. It's a run with a team that I don't think we've seen since the likes of maybe Michael Schumacher with Ferrari, where Lewis just dominated the sport. It was very questionable when he joined Mercedes. It was a dominant run of, what was it, 8 Constructors' Championships in a row for Mercedes. Lewis obviously winning a bulk of his world championships, and it all comes to a close this weekend in Abu Dhabi for the final time. I think Mercedes is going to be motivated to send Lewis out on a high, obviously coming off the back of Qatar, which was very contentious for many reasons. But I cannot see a world in which Lewis is going to leave Mercedes on anything else than his best effort. And I think we're going to see it this weekend with a very good run from Lewis. We've seen what happens when Mercedes give him a car that he's confident in, like in Vegas. I think it's all going to come together this weekend in Abu Dhabi. Moving on now to biggest disappointment, and we turn to the French outfit of Alpine. My pick for biggest disappointment this weekend is going to be Jack Doohan. Now, there's obviously been a lot of press going around, swirling around the Alpine's handling of Esteban Ocon's situation. Obviously, if you somehow haven't seen, Alpine announced that they have dropped Esteban Ocon for the final race of the year, instead replacing him with Jack Doohan, who is obviously going to be taking his spot on the team next year. So wanting to give Jack a bit of a head start jumping in the car for the final race weekend of the season. It's since come out that it really just felt like a very unceremonious departure for Esteban Ocon, who obviously, since Alpine joins Formula One, taking over for Renault, obviously Esteban has their only win in F1, as well as a majority of their best performances, and so it felt like a very lackluster and just very weirdly contentious reaction to a driver that's given so much to the team. And so I think it's really putting Jack Doohan in an interesting position, or obviously he's going to be jumping into the car next season, and so it does make sense on paper what you give him an opportunity to have a race weekend before throwing him into the fire in 2025, and that all of that makes sense, right? But I think it's just the way that they handled the Esteban Ocon departure that really left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, and I think that puts Jack in a very bad position to potentially struggle. This is obviously going to be his first weekend, in the seat in F1, and I think it could come back when you have a relatively difficult-ish style circuit and conditions like Abu Dhabi, and jumping into an Alpine that obviously has been relatively, I'm not going to say unstable because we've seen Gasly perform very, very well, but obviously the two cars have not necessarily been the same. Now, the theory is that Jack will have the same upgrades that Pierre has had, so we'll get an interesting pace comparison between him and Pierre this weekend, but I think it just puts Jack in a very tough position, and I think it could come back to bite them in the end, especially with a lot of the emotions swirling around about Esteban Ocon's sudden departure. Could kind of set up Doohan to take a bit of the fall when they potentially underperforms in his first F1 race ever, which isn't necessarily going to be surprising. But when you look at the comparison, as Alpine is still definitely in the fight for P6 in the constructors, I know they took a huge leap forward in Qatar with thanks to Pierre Gasly's P5. My thoughts on that are clear in the past as a Haas fan, but at the same time, I think it kind of puts them in an awkward spot as Haas is still definitely in contention for P6. It's going to take a special result in Abu Dhabi, but it's definitely not out of the question. And does Jack really put them in the best position to fight if it really came down to it? I don't know. So unfortunately, Jack, I'm sorry. It's your first race in F1, but you're my pick for biggest disappointment. Let's move on to qualifying top 3, our final qualifying predictions of the season. And let's start in P3. And I've gone for the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc. Now, we've seen the Ferrari being pretty consistent over the last couple of weekends, but I do think that Charles, being as wanting to also end his season off on the high, we know how much he enjoys fighting for as high a position as he can in the drivers, now only 8 points behind Lando Norris. And so I think Charles is going to come out very focused on maximizing performance. And I think that P3 in qualifying might be about what the maximum the Ferrari could put out there. We saw in Qatar that while Ferrari were definitely quick, they were definitely a good step down from the top cars last weekend. And I think we could see something similar here, or P3 might be the maximum that Charles can get, but I think he's definitely going to do enough to get there and maximize the car to its potential. So without further ado, Charles, P3 in my predictions for qualifying. Moving on now to P2 in qualifying, and this one is another driver whose car has definitely seemed to, when shown it's in the right window, definitely can get the most out of the car, and we've seen him do it multiple times. It's Max Verstappen. I think that Red Bull has started to we've seen them kind of take a step forward once again. Obviously, Max getting the most out of the car week to week. We saw them really dial in the setup window for that Red Bull last weekend, where we saw Red Bull really struggle in a sprint race to then turning it around quickly, effectively in a couple of hours into the main Grand Prix qualifying and therefore the race. And so I think Red Bull are starting to finally kind of get back on top of their car. And while we do make jokes about them not necessarily having the fastest car this season, they're still definitely clearly one of the top 3 teams on the grid right now. And Max is fantastic at maximizing every result from that car. And I think it starts this weekend and once again win P2 in qualifying. And then last but not least, P1, my pole position is Lando Norris. I think Lando, coming off of last weekend, should have a good amount of momentum moving forward. Obviously, he did receive that 10-second stop-go penalty for failing to slow under the double-waved yellows, but at the same time, from basically before then to getting that penalty, we've seen him perform very, very well in the races and actually do decently in qualifying. I think a more simplified racetrack like Abu Dhabi would give him an opportunity to kind of stretch his legs a little bit in qualifying. We saw him start P3 in Qatar, and I think we'll see him kind of get back on top of it. And I think McLaren is definitely going to want to end on a high as they continue to chase down the constructors title. They want to wrap that up as best they can, and I think it's going to start by giving him a car worthy of a good qualifying. And so I think Lando, good enough to put it on pole. So that wraps up my top 3 of a Lando Norris pole position, a Max Verstappen P2, and a Charles Leclerc P3. All right, race podium, our final race podium of the season. Can you believe it? I still say it every time, and I don't quite understand it. I really don't. And I think let's go ahead and start with my pick for P3. And I think it's the race pace master, Lewis Hamilton, finishes his career at Mercedes on the podium in P3. Not necessarily, I don't think it'll be good enough to finish near enough for a win, but I do think Lewis has shown in the race that he has the pace to basically fly through the field. It's really his qualifying that kind of lets him down the most, but at the same time, I think we're going to see Lewis finish on the podium. I think it would be a nice finishing point for his time at Mercedes. And I think it's also very indicative of the struggles that Mercedes has had once the 2022 regs came in, where you've really just seen them very, very much struggle. And I think finishing on the podium with Lewis will definitely be a good send-off for him in his time at Mercedes. So Lewis, let's get it done. Let's get that qualifying up. And if we can start top 5, I think this is almost a shoo-in at this point. And then moving on to P2, I have gone for Lando Norris. And I think this is going to be an instance of potentially, I don't think obviously Lando is going to be focused solely on just finishing ahead of the Ferraris, but I think this could be a situation in where if you have a Max and Lando front row start, we all know how Max likes to be extra aggressive and how good he is in that second phase of the start. And I think it could lead to a contentious battle at the front, but we've also seen some races at Abu Dhabi kind of get a little tire managey. And if Max is able to get into the lead and use that fresh air that clean air to extend that gap, I think it could be very hard for McLaren to kind of strategize themselves back into that race. And so, not to get too foreshadowy into my winner prediction, but I think Lando will take a P2 finish. I think it'll be pretty indicative of his season with McLaren. They've had a very good car for a lot of the season, but for one reason or another, just can't seem to get over that hump of getting those consistent wins. And so I think it continues once again this weekend in Abu Dhabi. Lando Norris, P2. And then that leaves only my pick for the winner of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. And if it hasn't been clear already, I have gone for Max Verstappen. I think I'm going with a lot of storylines of, very it just makes sense for them to finish here. Max begun the season with a win. I think he'll end the season with a win. We saw the pace that he had in Qatar last weekend once they got the car into a suitable window for, of performance. And I think with 3 full practice sessions, I think we're going to see them do it again this weekend. And I think Max is going to finish basically where he's kind of been hovering around for most of the season, which is around the top he can. He's going to get the maximum out of the car. We know that. I mean, he does it even when the car is the 4th fastest on the grid. He always seems to just get the most out of it. And I think it's going to come down to just Red Bull kind of just reasserting themselves that while he did go a very long stretch of the season without a win, I believe, what was it? It was Spain to... It was Spain to something or other, but it was in this last stretch. It was Brazil, wasn't it? It might have been. Regardless, it was a very long stretch with Max without getting a win, but at the same time, we still saw him perform very, very well. And as we see Red Bull kind of make a bit of a resurgence down the stretch of this season, I think it's going to cap itself off with Max capping his Drivers' Championship, 4th consecutive Drivers' Championship in a row with a win in Abu Dhabi, especially considering he's won, I believe, was it the last 4 straight? So he definitely enjoys this circuit. He gets the most out of the car at this circuit. And I think we see it again with the front row start next to Lando Norris. I think he'll be able to get into the lead and use that clean air to kind of generate that gap. And I think he'll be able to hold on to it by the end. So there we have it. A race podium of a Max Verstappen win, a Lando Norris P2, and a Lewis Hamilton P3. Here we have it. Our final prediction for the 2024 season. Our one crazy prediction for the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. And this one, we had to keep it close to home. A Haas prediction is incoming. Haas obviously fighting for P6 in the Constructors, which they've generated a bit of a gap following the sprint race in Qatar, but a P5 by Pierre Gasly in the Grand Prix thanks to the FIA, we'll just call it shenanigans, in the Qatar Grand Prix, led to an Alpine P5 and getting 10 points, and now they are 6 points ahead of Haas, I believe, if my math and memory is correct. And so it's going to take a monumental effort from Haas to retake P6 in the Constructors, and that's why we're sticking with it. We're going optimism here. And my one crazy prediction is that a Haas car will finish ahead of 3 front-running cars. And now, what do I mean by front-running cars? I mean a Red Bull, a Ferrari, a McLaren, or a Mercedes. I think a Haas are going to come out and absolutely smash it, and they're going to finish ahead of at least 3 of those teams' cars. Now, that's not to say they beat both of them, but it will finish ahead of 3 of them. And so what that means, I think, if, we'll just use it for example, if Nico Hülkenberg finishes ahead of Carlos Sainz, Oscar Piastri, and George Russell, that is a prediction in the bag. I think Haas are going to come out and want to perform to their absolute maximum. And following a lot of contentious relationships and situations and energy going on at Alpine right now, it kind of sets up for a very exciting finish for the fight for P6 in the Constructors. It's a bit of a long shot, but there's just something in the air, in the vibes in my heart, that want Haas to come out and just perform the maximum that we've seen them so far. They've had a great run of form the second half of the season, and I'm hoping that it will culminate in an even stronger performance this weekend in Abu Dhabi. What do you guys think of my predictions? Let me know in the comment section below what you think is going to happen. It's going to be very, very fun. There's always something in the air about the final weekend of the season. We're obviously seeing a lot of drivers leaving the sport, having a lot of new vacancies and new driver seats being filled. A lot of rookies are going to come in next year, and so there's always a lot of excitement and a lot of emotions following the final race of the year. And we're going to see a lot of very fun, emotional things, a lot of storylines as this weekend goes on. So guys, I hope you enjoy the Grand Prix weekend. We'll be back after the weekend is over to talk about what we saw. We'll go over everything then. And then obviously here in a few days after that, we'll get our final race and season review in as well. I hope you guys enjoy the final weekend of the season. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.